I would really like to thank the ACP for this invitation, the Secretary General, Your Excellencies, and the honored guests. This is the second time I've come to the ACP for International Women's Day. And what I would like to express, first of all, is that you have the strength to continue the conversation. For many years, my colleagues at the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal would ask me, well, why do we keep having International Women's Day? Didn't we do that once or twice? This is a long, complicated conversation. It's about understanding, it's about recognition, but something much more profound than that. And we're having this conversation almost with the pretext that we're talking about girls or women. We're really talking about human beings as expressed through girls and women and some of the deepest need of the human being. And that is what I would like to talk about today. I would like to talk about female wartime slavery. Why such a joyous topic today when we could be celebrating things that are much more bon vivant? Well, this topic is essential. Orlando Patterson, a Jamaican sociologist who teaches at Harvard, wrote a book 20 years ago. It's almost 23 years now. And it's a book about democracy and freedom in ancient Greece. Among the means that he expresses the story is to look at how was freedom invented. It was invented in some ways in Greece because it was the opposite of what female slaves had to endure. One could understand, as Orlando Patterson states, that slavery was the equivalent of a social death. The person who was enslaved had no society upon which to relate. It was a social death. And in certain ancient Greek societies, they would go to war. War would be waged in order to get more female slaves. It was before Greece became an agricultural-based society, and so they didn't need men. They needed house slaves, basically women, and women who could produce other slaves, babies. And so many of the men were killed off, and the women were taken back to the city-states in Greece. And it's through this understanding of who lived in a state of social death that we could start to define who lived in freedom, who lived in liberty, and eventually who was free enough to vote in a society and have democracy. That's why I would posit that our conversation about women, about wartime female slavery, and in quotes, women's liberation, is something extremely profound. It's really a question about freedom, about democracy, about our deepest human needs. Wartime female slavery, unfortunately, has been a norm. It is not an incident that happens once in a while, that scares us, and we vow that will never repeat. It is part of our repeated patterns at war. If I could just take you back in history, not so ancient as Greece, but just to World War II. We know that there were over 200,000 women that were enslaved for the sexual pleasure of the Japanese army. This is quite contested in certain United Nations centers, but much more contested among the foreign affairs between Korea, Japan, and several countries in Southeast Asia. But let me take the time to explain how could we, in quotes, less than 60 years ago, have 200,000 women enslaved and have those facts denied? Well, it happens because how we understand and see women. Women are supposed to provide pleasure, at times sexual pleasure, and they're supposed to act as if it is their duty and their honor. That is how the Japanese sexual slavery was seen during World War II. On the surface, that's almost titillating. The men went to war all day and needed some sexual recreation. When one looks underneath, we understand that it's questions of colonialism. The women that were taken more readily were Korean because they were under Japanese colonial power. Taiwan was under colonial power. The other women that became part of this 200,000 core of modern female slaves were women who came from occupied territories once Japan invaded. Indonesia, East Timor, Burma, the Philippines, China. Need I continue? The list is of over 15 countries. Well, how could the women be taken? I mean, this seems to be impossible. They were placed on naval ships and vessels. Well, maybe the women volunteered. Maybe it was their patriotic duty. Some were abducted before 12 or 13. I bring this incident up because it is pervasive, and because with 200,000 women from 13 different countries, including European women who were living in Indonesia and Batavia, the undeniability of it shows our regard, or rather our disregard, for wartime female slavery. We like to think of heroic men who go to war. We don't like to think of men who have committed crimes, not only against the enemy, but against women supposedly on their own side. Let me bring up the other dilemma of wartime female slavery. There's a question of, well, is that really what a slave does? Sexual acts? I mean, slaves are supposed to be for chattel labor. And I, as a descendant of a slave, certainly know the images that we have in North America. And I think people in the Caribbean have shared some of the same images of working in the field, whether it be cotton or whether it be sugarcane. So when women are not working in the field, are they really enslaved, or is that just a little bit of forced prostitution? I mean, is sex really work? And if it's not work, can you be enslaved sexually? Well, in 1926, the Slavery Convention defined what was slavery. It's a beautifully, beautifully simple definition. It's exercising the powers, any or all of the powers, of ownership over someone. If someone can exercise powers of ownership over you, you have been reduced to slavery. You can be owned by your labor in the field, but you can be owned by sexual access. And the real truth is that most slavery that occurred in the Americas, in Africa, in certain instances in the Pacific, and certainly in Asia, that both men and women were sexually owned. That is how they reproduced other slaves. But in particularly, women were sexually owned. And that is why even today we have certain disregard for the sexuality or the sexual integrity of many women who are descendants of slaves or who have lived through colonial societies. I bring up that definition for a very specific reason. In 1997, I had the honor of being the legal advisor and one of the trial attorneys on the first modern case of wartime female slavery in Yugoslavia. The case was called the Prosecutor versus Kunarac. It is much more commonly known as the Foča case. Let me tell you the facts of the Foča case. It happened in a small town in what would now be called the Republic of Srpska, and it was a town that was taken over by Bosnian Serb army, and the persons who were occupied were Bosnian Muslims. As happens in many wartime scenarios, men are separated from women. The women were taken to the sports hall, and then they were taken to the high school, and then they were taken to other buildings. During the nighttime, as these village women slept or tried to sleep, Serbian soldiers would come in and select their daughters to take them out for rape. The women tried to hide their daughters. They would try and make their daughters look as unattractive as possible. But that didn't assist. Finally, most of the women were deported outside of the Republic of Srpska into Bosnia. But the Bosnian soldiers decided that we would hold some of the women back, and we would sell them off to the rotating soldiers who would come in, or we would bargain them away. And those women who were held back were held in what is a euphemistically called term of a brothel. It wasn't a brothel. It was a slave encampment. And other women were given to specific officers. My goodness, how do we have the information from that case? We're lucky. A few of the women escaped. Many didn't. Many of the girls, I shouldn't say women, 13-year-olds, were killed or disappeared. But a couple were exchanged in the end for 500 Dutch marks, a television set. When you apply the 1926 convention to them, exercising the powers of ownership over someone, these women were enslaved. They were wartime female slaves. The question was asked, well, why didn't they just run away? They weren't in chains. They had the key to certain doors. Well, where was there to run and occupy territory? And that's to emphasize that the slave doesn't have to prove that they can run away. They're not prisoners of war who have a duty to escape. The slave just has to have someone exercising powers of ownership over them. Well, we could have been quite satisfied and said we've had a fabulous win. It was precedential. International criminal law, in many ways, hailed this as a landmark case. What was unfortunate is that we found that those fact patterns applied to that law happened in repeated incidences. So there are cases in the former Yugoslavia that were not prosecuted, but that could have similar fact patterns of, in particularly, young girls and females having the powers of ownership exercised over them. But let's change wars. Did it happen again after that, most recently? Sierra Leone. In the armed conflict in Sierra Leone, girls, and particularly girls, were taken to be the sexual accompaniment of guerrilla soldiers. Boys were also taken and supposedly recruited as child soldiers. What we learned from the legal analysis of those cases is that on the surface, the recruitment that was geared toward the young boys, of course, is a fallacy. Whether boys are enlisted, conscripted, recruited into an army because their family has been killed or because they want revenge, they are too young to understand the concept of killing or being killed. And the court ruled that a child soldier cannot obviate the crime because of any form of consent or willingness. The girls in these 4 cases that come out of Sierra Leone, the Charles Taylor case, the RUF case, the AFRC case, and the CDC case, were not necessarily considered recruited because even though they might have bore arms, they didn't go through training. They were almost immediately sexually assaulted and placed in pools where soldiers could have complete access to them sexually after hard days at war, or where, if they were lucky, soldiers would select them and only have sex with them. Let me rephrase that, only rape them. To a certain extent, some of those women felt protected. If any of you are in New York, you'll see that there's a play with Lupita Nyong'o now called Eclipse, which really talks about 4 different women who are owned by one of the Sierra Leonean fighters. But the narrative that I want to explain in Sierra Leone is that once again, we have girls and women who are wartime female slaves. They cannot really run away. They can be killed if they run away. But they're not just forced to have sex, they're forced to have children, abortions, birth in the bush. And so we have to look at this notion of what does a female slave do? And what I've written is that it's too painful for us to really understand that. We feel much better of thinking of slavery in labor as opposed to slavery in constant sexual abuse and assault. But if sexual access to that extent is exercising a power of ownership, the simplicity of the 1926 Convention is applicable. As a matter of fact, in New Orleans, in the United States, during the period of official slavery, many women were held in New Orleans brothels. These were really enslaved women. They might have had the prettiest clothes on, smelled like magnolia, and acted as if they were really flirting and somehow titillated and owned the men that were coming there. The female sexual slave can be beautiful and well-dressed, or can be a small child who has never even understood the concepts of sexuality. If I may, and unfortunately one must, continue to where are we looking at modern female slavery. And if we go into Iraq and we look at the Yazidi females or girls, we see that not only in the midst of what I certainly would call a genocide, that they are being separated from men and males. If you look at the Syrian Commission report, some are having virginity tests conducted on them to find out will they be pure virgins, hence have a higher price when they're sold to fighters. And then ISIL has issued in the past 3 months how one is to treat the female wartime slave. A male is not to rape a female slave that doesn't belong to him. If two sisters are slaves in one house, they are to be separated in terms of who owns them. They are not to be a common pool. A father cannot rape the slave of his son unless the son gives the slave to the father. These are the written rule books of female slavery in modern times, I mean within the past year. One of the things that, as an international criminal lawyer, and particularly as a former prosecutor, I thought I would never see, would be a videotape of perpetrators incriminating themselves while conducting a slave auction. But one can go to YouTube and see fighters who talk about the female slaves that they will buy, preferably the young girls, certainly all versions. I would like to say that female slavery at wartime happens because we reached our lowest level of humanity. I think in part that is true, but I also think in part it's how we treat and understand and feel and appraise or reject women and their sexual integrity during wartime and non-wartime, that we still today, in 2016, can have a rule book of how to treat the female slave. I would hope that these unsavory, actually inhumane facts leads us back to our modern appreciation, as Orlando Patterson would say, of really what is freedom. I think in today's terminology, freedom would be the absence of human rights violations. We don't talk about a right to freedom anymore. Via decolonization, we talked about self-determination of nations. And within some of the protocols, the Maputo Protocol in Africa, we talk about the individual's almost right to self-determination. Freedom as a right has fallen out of favor. We talk about the right to peace, and here at the ACP, the right to development. But if one does not have the right to freedom, which when you talk to enslaved people, descendants of enslaved people, that word keeps popping up. I want to be free. Fighting for freedom or liberation. I would like to say on International Women's Day that this is not a uniquely female yearning to be free, but it is one that females have paid with. They've paid with their life. They've paid with their social death. They've paid with outrageous acts being committed upon them in an everyday situation of war. And even if it appears that they're protected because they're the favored wife of the warlord, they are not free. I would hope that our International Women's Day, that we're allowed to make this conversation not part of our celebration, but part of our recognition of the work that still has to be done. At different levels around the world, women are not free economically, often not free from domestic abuse, often not free to pursue and thrive in the employment they want on a woman's schedule, so that if she wants to have children, if she wants to take time off, if she wants to suffer through menopause, that she's allowed to and not lose space in the job market. I hope that we take this concept of freedom that female slaves have lived in the opposite and apply it to how women should live every day of their lives around the world. But in honor of the female slave, in honor of the eyes that we don't want to stare into because we can't hold the gaze, because the mirror fractures, because maybe we see just a tiny part of ourself or the hopelessness of our institutions and our society. Maybe if we are brave enough to hold that gaze just a little bit longer, the female slave will lead us to freedom. Thank you very much.